If there's one thing that we all learn by watching children and adults shift school and work to a virtual remote format over the last 2 years, is that there's a huge difference between showing up and actually engaging.
And just because you attend an online class, it doesn't mean that you are actually engaging in that class and actually learning and growing your mind.
In the same way, there's a huge difference between a patient properly using, i.e., being compliant with or adhering to the use of a medical device at home, and a patient actively seeking to squeeze every ounce of clinical value out of that device to improve their own outcomes.
Increasingly, the healthcare and medtech industries are evolving to support remote diagnosis, monitoring, and treatment of health conditions by patients and their caregivers. But without the benefit of the doctor's office, hospital, or real-time supervision, this can get complicated.
So how do we get patients and their caregivers not just to use devices, but to actively engage with them in the best way possible to improve their own healthcare? And for those with chronic conditions, how do we make this happen as a regular routine that just happens without intervention by the provider or payer?
That's what we're going to be discussing in this 3-part series on patient engagement in connected medical devices, presented by Orthogonal.
I'm Bernhard Kappa, founder and CEO of Orthogonal. We're all about improving patient outcomes faster. We mostly work in software as a medical device and connected medical device systems, and we apply modern methods within the regulatory constraints to build, evolve, and scale solutions faster.
And I'm Adrian Pittman, user experience design and human factors expert, currently director of product design at LinkedIn, previously at Google and Orthogonal. We'd like to thank you for joining us today to listen to the second of a 3-part series from our recent conversations with 2 fantastic industry experts, Senior Director of User Experience at Becton Dickinson, Gia Roselles, and Christy Zuber, Founder and Director of Aspen Labs, a leading human-centered design agency servicing the medical industry. We're going to dive into the art and science of user-centered research and design processes for medical devices. This is a really rich topic since our panelists bring a tremendous breadth and depth of experience to this exciting but also really challenging domain. There's a lot of ground we're going to cover, looking at not just UX for medical devices, but for healthcare more generally, and also what we can learn in healthcare from UX in other industries. So without further ado, we'll jump back into this conversation we had with Gia Roselles and Christy Zuber.
So Gia, I had one question for you. Your background's really interesting between Intuit on the one side, which is definitely very much focused on the consumer and small business, et cetera, and probably a ton of freedom in terms of how you collect data, how you run experiments on what works and what doesn't work, and then comparing that with the highly regulated, safety conscious area that you're in BD. What's the difference between those? And are there things that you feel like, oh, I was able to take these things from Intuit and bring them to the current position, or things that, oh, I wish we could do these things here because we could innovate much faster and get a better product much faster?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think for me personally, getting up to speed on medical regulations for different devices, FDA and outside the US agencies and what they require, that was personally for me my first hill that I had to climb. But it actually was more straightforward than I expected. But what I discovered in manufacturing devices is really the same big problem that we were trying to solve year over year at Intuit, which is the tendency of companies that are trying to move fast, make money quickly, to assume that they know what the user needs and who the users are. And that inevitably leaves open the possibility of putting something on the market, going through all that expense and development and marketing, and then realizing nobody wants it, or that it solves an important problem, but for the wrong user, or it solves it in the wrong way. And so, this getting back to the basics, as Christy was talking about earlier, you've got to go and meet the user, you've got to be in their environment. That's the only way to know. And so, I do think that really having a deep understanding of the user is what I took from one industry to the other.
Now you're singing my song.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's two parts to it, right? You're trying to design a product that meets real user needs and that they're going to buy and all of those things. That's universal, right?
Yes.
That's everywhere. And if you skip those first steps, and you skip actually understanding the users, and you know those users, and all of us do that, like I know what these people want. I just know it,
I've
right?
been doing this for years.
I've been doing this for years, right? And so that, that totally makes sense. I've seen that outside of the medical device industry. I've seen it in the medical device industry. I've seen it in pharma everywhere. But one of the things that is interesting that I've at least observed outside of the medical device industry versus inside the medical device industry is what kind of real-time, real-world data are you getting about your devices and what you're doing? If you think about a company like Amazon, for example, right? That on their websites is running experiments on you left, right, and center in an automated fashion and in an automated way, queuing up the next experiments in massively parallel form to optimize for whatever they want to optimize. Typically, you buying more things on their site or other things that lead other people to buy more on their site. But they can optimize really quickly. And even if you design the perfect product, or you think you are, right, through qualitative information that you're getting through the design process, we all know that in reality, when people are actually using it in the wild, you can't fully simulate. You actually have to see how are they really actually using it, and there's no way to fully simulate it. They're going to do things that are surprising to you,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
So I assume that those kinds of lessons are the same, whether it's Intuit or Becton Dickinson, right?
Yeah, it
Uh,
often it gets down to the smallest detail, as Christy mentioned earlier, not understanding the word browser. You just have to look at everything and make zero assumptions about your users. You have to just involve them and keep getting feedback from them to keep reducing your project risk and increasing the chances that you're building the right thing really well. Oddly, when I was at Intuit, when we get towards Thanksgiving and the IRS deadline and we needed to get that product done, people were practically sleeping there overnight. And I would say, we want to do this really well. People's money and livelihood is at stake. And it's still tax software. It's not life and death. So now at Becton Dickinson, it is life and death. And we have to do it better.
It's interesting though. It's like the more technical, and I've seen this in a number of industries, the more technical the problem is, the more assumptions are being made at a very early stage. And it's like this idea of how you start pretty much dictates how you end. And is the core job to be done or jobs to be done of the user, are those really being satisfied? So, an example is, so I actually think the Amazon example, that happens later. Once you've identified value, then you can productionalize your supply chain to give you real-time data and you get the value of that because now you're tuning, you're iterating. But it's when you first get started, if you stomp on the wrong pedal, you're not going to get the results you need at all because it's completely the wrong solution for the wrong problem. And it comes back to like basic fundamentals. It's something that we talk about in the article series that we wrote for the MedTech Intelligence journal, is this notion that people use features, but
Mm.
they live with products. And so if you're going to develop a product that you expect a person to live with, particularly if it's life and death, then you really do fundamentally have to start and devote enough time and energy on understanding and building empathy for the user up front. Otherwise, everything else that you do doesn't matter. I mean, yeah, the Amazon productionalization model won't work if they didn't understand what value was at the transactional level on a daily basis, the sorts of buying experiences people wanted to have. And they started off with books, right? I mean, you know,
Yeah.
Right.
Right. You know, one of the things I see far too frequently is that people go do some initial research and then they stop getting feedback
Yeah.
Right.
on things. Or they get feedback then and maybe do some summative human factors and maybe one or two formative human factors along the way. But Gia, you mentioned getting feedback and then keep getting feedback. And this is for both you and Christy. What does that mean, keep getting feedback? And how would you, in an ideal world, would you want to get feedback? How frequently and what form?
I think in medical devices, getting that input from you early and continually feeds right into the human factors validation, the summative work that needs to get done. And it's a way of proving to the FDA and other agencies that we've had enough user input and testing throughout this project to help prove that it works for users safely. At that point, if you get frequent enough testing happening, your summative is a piece of cake because you've already tested everything.
Right.
And I'm a big fan of, looking at things from a longitudinal standpoint. If you're really truly co-designing, your design should be evolving as you're learning. I mean, it's a feedback loop. And so if you build it in that way, as you evolve and change your product, your service, probably some of both, you need to be finding out some from new people and some from those that have been with you, how that continues to work for them over time. Has this addressed these issues? How has it not? And there's lots of, I think, tools and ways of doing that. Some things are just, you know, old school, one-on-one interviews with people, or, ethnographic observations in the context of where they are, or maybe utilizing, a tool like a virtual ethnography, like a D-Scout or something. There's lots of ways of doing that and sort of keeping in contact with people over time. And I think those kinds of things are really important. And you build that base, because I do think that there's a learning curve, both for the people trying to, I think, engage your user, as well as, and this might sound silly, but kind of a learning curve as to how do you give feedback as a user? What am I, what am I
Sure.
looking for? And I do
Hmm.
think that, if you have a certain, sort of subset of the population that you're getting feedback with, as you continuously do that with them, they're on the lookout for how things are working at those in between times, because you're not with them all the time. You look at things differently once you really know how to critique and what you're looking for. And I think you can have those kind of a super feedback version of a super user is,
Right.
that can really provide some really amazing stuff, because it doesn't slip past them. They're always on alert, which I think is a pretty neat thing. So, I think really in the spirit of co-design, your design evolves, not just once, but many times. So
that sounds like I hear you saying it's an operational practice, though, right, Christy?
I think so. Absolutely. I've worked in health systems my entire life, and, I've spent lots of time, in the communities that are interacting with the things that we do. And, there's the development of the product or service, sort of if you look at it across time, there's trying to understand the needs. And we've spent time talking about, if you don't get the need right, everything else really doesn't matter. So there's understanding that need, and you're probably not going to get that right the first time. So there's evolutions and evolving that happens there. And then once you actually have that, starting to work with people, work out the kinks, see how those things actually integrate into their lives. And then as you sort of start to scale it, to operationalize it, to get it in a place where it's actually repeatable at a larger scale, you will have a whole different set of new learnings that you need. And so it is this continuous process improvement. This is continuous user engagement over time, so that you're not just tweaking your internal operations, you're tweaking them and you're changing them to meet the needs of the people that you're serving at whatever stage you're at.
I think early user research was mentioned by Adrian, and that is definitely I think, the most important place to invest
Hmm.
and the place that gets the shortest shrift right now. We just are dying to jump into development.
Yeah. Get that thing out there.
It's
Yeah.
it's
1,000%.
it's amazing we start developing before we know what problem we're solving and what we're developing. It astounds me still. So investing in that early user research lets us define what the problem is and what product or feature or functionality we're going to build to solve that problem. And then as we get into development, we keep bringing users in to do usability tests that tells us whether we're developing that product correctly. So we need to build the right product for the right user, and we need to build it correctly. And those are all just different phases that happen during R&D, and users are necessary for all of them.
So double clicking on that, so there's another component to this that I want to get your perspective on is time. So as an example, I worked with the Android team at Google, and Android is 12 to 18 month releases. So you can't really test an operating system. So all of your information is coming from a prior
Yes.
release and the insights that you gain from that. And then during the course of your effort, you're effectively guessing using, it's informed guesses to a certain extent, but you really don't know and you
Mhm.
won't know for at least a year. And hardware is very much the same way. It's very hard to iterate on hardware.
Yes.
And so, to your earlier point, you definitely want to iterate through your process, particularly when you're in your formative stages of things. But how do you solve for the time factor when it's not going to work and like the data signal is so delayed on what you're doing?
In hardware, the timeframes are very long, and that, Bernard, is one of one of the things that's different from Intuit. We moved fast. We had 9 months basically to get everything right, whereas a complex hardware product, an infusion pump, robotic pharmacist can take 5, 10 years.
Right.
All the more reason, though, to keep bringing users in to check ourselves, because in that long a time frame, it's so easy to go off track. There are hundreds of design decisions that need to get made. And I think what we need to do is, as we're going along, the team needs to ask, okay, what decision do we need to make? What do we need to know in order to design this next piece? And for any part of that piece that's going to be user facing, we bring in user input. 100 decisions don't require user input because they're not user interactions with the device interface. But for every decision that will be part of the UI, take the time there to double check with users. And over many years, that is difficult, but the majority of it is happening in the beginning where we're defining the problem and defining the product. And then usability testing as we go along is actually quite straightforward and easier.
This is another area, again, where if we look to the future in the present in diabetes, right? One of the challenges there is everything is changing so quickly in the ecosystem. Obviously, people are relying on smartphones and they're updated and new smartphones and there are new apps, new things, new everything, new integrations potentially, and adoption of certain technologies that are happening and more closer interoperability between all these things. So even where the hardware timelines are long, the software and integration timelines are getting shorter because you're relying on a whole bunch of other things that are changing quickly.
That's true.
So if you're, designing the right thing for people right now, their behavior is going to change. Their use of technology is going to change during that time period. And so your assumptions that based on research you did a year ago or 2 years ago or for longer may no longer apply, right?
That's true. And that's a big risk that the manufacturer takes. I think it's important in the beginning to also to look at to stay on top of trends in the medical industry, trends in the different areas that are relevant in electronics and batteries and the ways Christy is improving the hospital and the interfaces between the patient and the doctor. It requires staying on top of as much of that future trends as possible to reduce the risk of building something too late. It doesn't match the currentness of the world.
Yeah. I'm curious how often this sort of thing happens in the medical device arena and working within a healthcare system. We would create these very immersive experiences that we would bring in care providers and patients. And, we'd have a mocked up home area, for example, and we would sort of Wizard of Oz things all over the place, blow into your phone and it'll check your blood sugar level or, stuff that really didn't exist. But you would sort of be immersed in this thing and it would feel like it did work and people would come up on the screen and, you do a consultation with them and then something would, show up on the screen in the home that you were in. Of course, it's all mocked up, but these kinds of things would give us a sense and then we'd get feedback and we'd see how people would interact and then we'd evolve it again and we'd evolve it again and we'd evolve it again. And that for us, whether it was trying to figure out how you would have a car that would pick you up and provide you care on the way to the hospital through an autonomous driving experience or different things in the home. I think those kind of immersive Wizard of Oz testing of things gives you a great place to evolve and try things in spaces where it takes a long time. And we did that whether it was the home space or something in a hospital where we're developing a new way that things would function in a hospital. And it takes years, to get a new hospital up and running and the new equipment built up in it and the new technology and what have you. And so I found that those immersive, interactive scenarios, Wizard of Oz testing, where people can touch it, feel it, um, really helpful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This reminds me of the Ford Health did this where they built a lab version of what would eventually be their office model that they would spin out and syndicate.
Mm-hmm.
And it ran as a living, breathing lab where they were injecting technology. A lot of it was worked, but it worked through a bunch of back layer complications. And it was a very involved and robust investment. It solves the 0 to 1, but then you've got a 1 to 10 problem, which is completely separate, which is how do you scale it? And it feels to me that a lot of the software and hardware that we're dealing with in this transitional period seems to be stuck in a 1 to 10 problem, which is I get how this could be solved, but the investment or the time or the confidence is not there. And it's that sluggishness that I think causes some teams to make more conservative decisions and completely miss the mark. But do you find that was like once you got through the imagine, if you will, Christy, did you find that there was like a moment where it was like, okay, now it's time to put butts in seats and write checks and make commitments? Still don't want to do it, right? was there was
Well, yeah, sometimes, but I would say having ways that people can touch and feel and interact is the best change management and buy-in tool that you could ever have within an organization because it's not foreign anymore. People have had a felt experience. They feel like they've put their fingerprints on something. So they're much more willing to take it to the next step. So we actually had a much easier time getting things to the scale and spread level when we created these immersive experiences, when we were able to bring people in to touch it, feel it themselves, see how patients were interacting with it, or if they weren't physically there, videoing the experience so then they could watch it and say, well, I didn't ever imagine someone would do it that way, or that was not in my purview. So it wasn't just, people sort of sitting around in a room making up what they thought would happen or hypothetically talking about it. It was much closer to an actual lived experience before we could have the lived experience. And so we found it amazingly helpful. And, so any places, in my opinion, that can have that sort of immersive experience, it provides far more value than just the step one.
Mm-hmm.
It helped us throughout those steps.
did you find a similar experience here?
Yeah, we invest a lot of time in prototypes. We have a simulation lab that works like a hospital. We have an operating room, an ICU, a regular patient room with background noises of busyness and people going in and out to interrupt the user to see what would happen. We build prototypes at various stages wherever it makes sense and have users get their hands on it. Sometimes instead of the real screen, there's an iPad where we've mocked up a wireframe of what would occur, and we watch users try to use that. And then I think Christy made a great point, which is it's really valuable to watch users do that and
Yeah.
to get a video that you can show the executives, but even better to bring the
Mhm.
executives in
Yeah.
and either have them watch live or have them try it.
Because as you said, it's surprising how, even in this day and day, how often products get built because people assume they know what the user needs. And I know it. I don't need to do any research. And then lo and behold,
Yeah.
That's the biggest part of my job, is convincing executives and subject matter experts that they actually don't know as much as they think they do.
The expertise trap is for real.
It is.
so how do you go about doing that? What's worked for you in terms of convincing those executives? Because, it's one we've all faced, right?
Yes. In a situation where, as you pointed out earlier, we sometimes lack quantitative data, we need to use our qualitative methods to prove things. And the only really reliable way that I've seen that basically never fails
Mhm.
is running tests with users and proving that the user can't do what the executive thinks they can do. It always works. The engineers, the executives, the marketing people, they all think they know the right way to do this. The only way to really make sure everybody gets it is to have them watch users fail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny, Gian, talking about that. I remember one time we were working on patient discharge processes, and it started out very focused on, how do we reduce readmission rates, basically, so that when people go home, that they go home safely and ready to go home. And how do we know that they're ready to go home? And, to make sure they're not coming back into the hospital for the same thing, which nobody wants. The health system doesn't want that, and insurance company doesn't want that. The patient doesn't, like, nobody wants that. And so when we started that, it was very focused on the conversations, what was being pulled out of the medical record, to have those conversations before they left, how they got their medications. There are all these things we were working on. And then literally when we hopped in the car with the patients and started, in riding home with them, and then we would film like, okay, here we go. Now you're home. And we got all this footage of, people, getting out of the car with their walker, hobbling up, and then they can't even get into their home because they have 18 steps to get up there. So these simple breakdowns of, okay, well, maybe now we actually need to think about how the transition happens at home, or how do we know what the home situation is, but there's no amount of conversations that would have gotten us there. The conversations were very focused on, protocol and et cetera, et cetera. But as soon as you can show that example, show a video of someone standing there at a complete loss, not knowing how to take that literal next step, that's worth everything.
It is.
Whether it's fumbling with your product or trying to take another step in the journey of whatever it is they're attempting to do, those things are so powerful.
It's the only way.
Sometimes, though, you can actually, the starting point could be quantitative data. I remember for one product we were developing a while ago, it was around basically all the perioperative processes before an operation and after an operation. And the data showed that there were a lot of readmissions basically because the incision wound opened back up. It's like, why did it do that?
Yeah.
So you have at least the starting point of something is happening. And when you go in and observe those things, it turned out one of the things that was happening is people got home, and because they had this operation, this wound, they needed to sort of rearrange their furniture and how they were living so they could be more comfortable.
Yes.
Well, that process of moving the furniture around was in some cases what caused that wound opening back up. And that turned into, okay, one of the steps you could do before this operation happens is go move those things around or get help moving those things around, because your life for at least a month or so is going to be quite different and you want to be comfortable.
That's a great example. And we do sometimes have quantitative data. I mean, I can see every
Mm.
button push, every entry that every nurse makes on million infusion pumps that we have, and I can tabulate where the problems are. Then I have to go to qualitative to figure out why that's a problem. Why on earth is this wrong medication amount getting input? Why is that
Hmm.
happening? And then you get back into the qualitative where you have to watch and look.
Yep. And that's the whole, you get quantitative, qualitative, quantitative, and
Yeah.
if you can have a short cycle, then that you can improve a product really
Right.
rapidly. But if you have a long cycle, then as Adrian said before, it's like, how do you build those things up? Because you don't necessarily, you only know qualitatively if what you did is actually going to move the needle and change something, right? Until you know it quantitatively.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of times you're dependent on second, third party sources if you don't have quantitative upfront. I always tell my teams that the qualitative is for context, quantitative is for scale. So if you have a trend, but to understand exactly what that trend means, it may not be evident by looking at the raw data. You need to apply, like, why are people doing X or why are people not doing Y? It's the qualitative that always provides that. It's one of the reasons why I always try to encourage teams to think in terms of compatibility between user
Hmm.
research and any sort of performative data that comes out of a system, because you're going to need to pull those two things back together and cross compare that data.
Yeah, I like how you explained that.
But then this takes me to another question that it's a theme that's sort of interwoven through a lot of the comments over the last period of time here is if we think about from the person, the end user, the
Hmm.
human being who's actually using the product, right? We're not talking about the practitioner in this particular instance. We're talking about the patient, the person receiving the care. We know, obviously adherence and compliance are big ticket items in the in the medical industry. And we talk about this concept in our article series about lifestyle integration and the importance of people being able to, again, live with the product. It fits within the confines of the world that they exist, the way they prefer to do things, in maybe not an optimized way, right? It affords different levels of technical literacy and so forth. When we talk about that, though, it's a concept. In your views, Christy and Gia, what does that mean for you? Like lifestyle integration, does that resonate? Is that a part or a signal? Maybe it's an analog for something else that you do in your practices. And how do you ensure that component makes its way into the product design work that you do?
Yeah. I would say first you would need to have some understanding of what that person's lifestyle is, which we've been spending a lot of time talking about. So, because you can't really have lifestyle integration of your product if you don't understand their lifestyle in the first place, what that means to someone, I think people are willing to do, some small things for a value that comes out at the end of the day. Think what they're not willing to do is to feel like their life is revolving around whatever device, whatever flow that equipment forces upon them. And you see that a lot. People don't want to feel sick. People don't want to feel like they're tethered to something. They want to live the best healthy life that they're able to where they are. And so when I think about life integration, I think that it's really at the end of the day, it's their perception. Do they feel like they're still able to live their best healthy life, even though they have to collect this or cycle? If because I think life integration is, and if they perceive and they're not beholden to something, they don't have to give up important things in their life, then I think it is lifestyle integration.
I think for all of the wearables and home technology that we've been talking about, there are aspects that we basically never have to consider when we're creating a device for a hospital setting. If it's a user who's going to be using it at home or if they're going to be wearing it, carrying it with them, we have to think about, as Christy and Adrian, what you said, what's their lifestyle? Where are they going to be using it? What kind of motion will be happening? Will it make noises that will let other people know that something's going
Yeah.
on? It needs to be discreet. It needs to be simple, absolutely ease of use. There's no place where we need it more than any kind of device that a patient themselves is going to have to use on their own. So there are lots of lifestyle aspects that we need to solve for that we don't have to with hospital devices, and we're not used to considering as part of our requirements.
Yeah. Here's another kind of example of, I think, lifestyle integration is the Veterans Administration was 35%. It might be more. I wish I had this statistic off the top of my head of the veterans population lives in a rural area, hundreds of miles away from, a larger medical care facility. And so, in trying to understand how to serve that population, they started looking at what is the lifestyle? Where are those veterans going? What are they doing? They had, to your point earlier, quantitative data on what they needed, what their conditions were, et cetera. And one of the things that came up is the VFW posts. They had the communities that they were part of, the VFW posts that they would go to, they would socialize, with each other. And so they put some of the ability to do remote visits and testing, et cetera, in those places because they were already going there for other things. And so leveraging something that might have been kind of unexpected yielded big implications for them, as well as, they looked at the number of them that were within a certain distance of a Walmart. Same thing. So partnered up with Walmart to be able to put things in the settings of Walmart. So I think if you understand lifestyle, I think that's also an example where it might not be something that's wearable, it might not be something in their home, but if you understand the natural paths of a person's daily habits, daily routines, daily lives, you might be able to integrate something into that won't fit on their wrist, that won't go into their home, but they come across it in their natural path, and it could make a really big difference.
That's a great point.
I remember not that long ago, I was visiting my mom in upstate New York, and we went to the grocery store, and, there was one of those Higi machines that she was just part of her process of going to the grocery store was she sat down and she had measured her blood pressure and pulse and, various things that were there. The machine got a printout of that and was like, oh, do you do this every time that you
Hmm.
go to the grocery store? It's like, yeah, I
Yeah.
just do it. I just want to know. And, it's like, okay, there it is. It
Yeah.
made sense for her and it was leveraging what she was already doing. It was sort of one additional habit that she could easily attach to one she already had. And so I think that's part of it is also if you think about things like, habit formation, it's a lot easier if you're adding something to a habit that they already have rather than creating something new whole cloth, right?
You must also be a BJ Fogg fan.
I'm a BJ Fogg fan, and I'm a James Clear fan, and
Yes.
all of those things.
Yeah,
Yes,
it was
yeah,
making me
yeah.
think as we were talking, one of the concepts is putting a hot trigger in the natural path of people. That same thing is, the natural path that they take. Is there something that they can do right away in that path that they're taking? I think all those behavioral change things are just quintessential when we're talking about that lifestyle integration.
Yeah. It's meeting people where they are.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's you can do just about anything for a week,
Yeah.
but especially for all of these chronic conditions, right? These are not do something for a week. This is
Yeah.
do something for the long haul, and that is really, really hard to do. So
Yeah.
half of what you're doing is really just trying to make things easier to, remember, more satisfying. All of the things that you do for habit formation are the kinds of things that
Yeah.
really you need to apply for chronic conditions.
Have you seen any good examples of lifestyle integration, either ones that you've seen or experienced or been a part of designing?
Again, diabetes wearables are the first thing that comes to my mind. An important thing is everybody on the development team needs to wear the device for a week themselves to see what the user is going to be going through and really get that. And then having real users use prototypes of the device in the real world as much as possible so that we know that we've captured as many of the lifestyle issues as we can. Because once we manufacture and sell it and a user has it, what Bernhard said starts to come into play, which is I've got a week, a month to get them to make this a habit. If it's not easy enough and it doesn't work well and fit into their lifestyle, we've lost that opportunity to have them make a habit out of it. And they'll just stop. You can build the greatest device technologically, but if users won't use it, pointless.
Totally. Going back to diabetes, right? You have folks that are type 1 diabetics and you have type 2 diabetics. Type 1 diabetics, you're born with it and that is your life. You have to deal with it, right? There's no, I've lived my life a certain way and now I'm being asked to change my behavior. That's what makes type 2 diabetes more difficult because people have built habits that in many cases have gotten them to this point, right? Whereas in type 1 is like, habit schmabit, I was born with this. And so those are two very, very different attitudes. And it's really hard to unlearn behavior as well. And so that's why also I think the problem for type 1 diabetics is, it's obviously they need insulin and all of these things. So it's a difficult medical condition and the technical problems are greater in many ways. But for type 2 diabetics, the behavior change problem is really, really, really hard. So I'm not sure I've seen so far anyone who's done like really solve the type 2 diabetic problem, right? Because it is so hard. But I'm starting to see at least more experiments around some of those things, and actually, again, using some of the habit change types of things now that are starting to happen there, right? Just, I think things like potentially a greater use of CGMs, which make the measurement, as long as you have one on, right, much more obvious. You can make correlations between behavior and what's actually happening because, you're getting the data for free, right? I mean, you don't have to do a finger stick every so often, et cetera, right?
That's a place where something like gamification might come into play, creating a habit by providing some sort of positive feedback that users get used to. Instagram makes sure that you get a dopamine hit every time you scroll through their feed. We need to find a way to give that kind of reward to people who are using medical devices.
Right. Make it more satisfying, right?
Yes.
That's really what it boils down to. And I'm not sure actually that people designing medical devices very often are thinking about, is it a satisfying
Right.
experience, right? Is it a clinically effective experience, right? Is safe experience,
Yes.
but not necessarily whether it's a satisfying.
I was just going to add to that. I think that if you look at like satisficers and maximizers, it's like most people in the medical space are probably patient-wise satisficers. They're going to look for what gets the job done without a whole lot of upheaval. I think, though, it is a matter of softening the blow when the behavior does not change sufficiently enough. That's also a high bar for a medical device when the blow is something to do with your own body. But I do think that that's an important signal for good UX design in general. It's like there's no real dead end. There's just sort of soft turns and things of that nature if you make a choice that maybe is suboptimal, and figuring out what that experience is like for, people who are using devices that they need to be more regular. It reduces the pushback that I think behavioral change programs tend to induce, which is you're trying to make me do something that I consciously do not want to do, and they're actively working against it. And I use as an example that's the app with the language training I forgot the name of the app now. The app where you learn to speak different languages.
Duolingo.
Thank you very much, Duolingo.
There you go.
There's a few others, but that's the one that comes to mind. Is like there's a certain type of user that's going to
Mhm.
follow through that pushed behavioral change, and it is trying to change your behavior. And there's a percentage of users that just won't do it. And figuring out what the soft exit ramp is, if there's an alternate path, just like, look, I'm just not going to do that, so that it isn't so brutal when you don't meet up to the happy path standard.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I think it's kind of when we talk about design of products, and one of the areas that I'm really passionate about is clinicians as a part of the team, and also clinicians when they're being trained as clinicians. And this is finally starting to happen, but it's very slow and isolated, is clinicians learning about human-centered design, co-design practices when they're going through their clinical training. So it's not just about the specifics and the technicalities of their clinical training, but how do you learn from people? How do you evolve ideas that you have? Because when you think about the individuals in those roles, and obviously I'm very personally passionate about this, particular areas of nurse myself, but the more you can understand how that happens, then I think you break that mindset which exists in clinical practice for so long that it's really about compliance. If I say someone needs to do something, I know they need to do it because, my data tells me if they don't, these 20 bad things will happen. But that's actually not how the change is going to happen. That is a rare case that you can educate somebody into a change. So I think as we start to look at product development going forward in the future, of course it's important, the medical device companies and all of that, how they do the work and how that looks. I think it's equally as important of these clinicians and other care providers as a part of that, the eyes, the ears, the arms, the legs of understanding what is happening. What are those needs? How do I speak to people in a different way about behavior change? How do I bring these products in? How do I give feedback to these manufacturers when I'm seeing things, that go awry, and what that looks like. I know, for example, I'm on the board for the American Nurses Association with the innovation focus, and that's one thing that's become really important in the ANA world is how do we begin to build up the confidence and the skills and the mindsets of the nursing workforce across the country as innovators, as co-designers, as we're bringing these things forward. And I think that's such a cool space, when we look at the possibilities in the future. Imagine a clinical workforce that has built that capability.
That's fascinating. I've never thought of it that way.
It's basically the theme that I'm picking up. That the care team is a part of the lifestyle integration. Like how they're integrated into the workflow
Hmm.
is a part of making sure that it fits with people's lives because they need help.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that care team might not necessarily just be physicians and clinicians. It could be a care provider in the home,
Yep.
a family member.
For CPAP machines, how a lot of that works, right, is that you have third parties that are setting these things up, helping people get everything going. It's not necessarily a clinician, and it's also not the medical device company. It's a third party. And someone along the way is getting paid for usage as opposed to just selling a device as well, and proper usage also. So,
Yeah.
That's right. And there may be new types of personas that come into play, like there are companies that are setting themselves up as technology centers so that the hospital lets them know we're implementing these devices for this user in their home, and the tech company sends somebody out to set it all up. A whole new kind of user will be in play, right? And also, when you're dealing with individuals who are working on their own healthcare through devices that or software or whatever that we're developing for them, we have to remember again the lifestyle issues getting into many, many, many different users' homes to really see what their world is like. One example that Randy Horton loves is I talked about a device that we had tested on many people, and we put it in homes, and we thought it was pretty bulletproof. User couldn't possibly make an error. Hadn't occurred to us that there would be users who have kids in the house. All kinds of unexpected things could happen.
I have no idea what that's like. I don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
Right, exactly. Kids and dogs. Yeah, that's right.
We'd like to thank our awesome guests for this podcast, Christy Zuber, the founder and managing director of Aspen Labs, and Gia Roselles, director of user experience at Becton Dickinson. I'm Bernhard Kappe.
And I'm Adrian Pittman. Make sure to come back for the third and final episode in this series. In it, we'll talk about what the future might hold for patient engagement as it relates to connected medical devices. We'll cover where we see real breakthroughs coming from in the future and some of the challenges we're still going to have to collectively tackle as an industry.
If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more content like it, you can check out Orthogonal's website at orthogonal.io. That's orthogonal.io. Our Insights section is regularly updated with fresh content related to connected medical device systems, software as a medical device, and digital therapeutics. You can also reach out to me at bkappe@orthogonal.io. That's BKAPPE@orthogonal.io.
Or reach me at iam@adrianpittman.com. That's IAM@adrianpittman.com. We look forward to hearing from you.